And the President of the United States addressing a joint session of Congress for the first time, not an arena that he's not familiar with because he served in the Senate for 3 decades and sat up there as vice president. But this is the first time he's addressed former colleagues and new colleagues as president of the United States, and really offering a broad, bold new plan to not only build America back, in his words, but build America back better with trillions and trillions of dollars in new spending. Our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes, is here, along with our Democratic strategist, Joel Payne, who's worked on Capitol Hill and in presidential politics. And Nancy, this is a lot what we expected, but there were some real moments of bipartisan appeal.
Right. And what you saw the president doing tonight, Norah, was swinging for the fences, trying to remind Republicans that there are some elements of his plans that they support as well. And he's got to try to pass these big, bold, ambitious plans now, because there's no guarantee that his party is going to continue to hold the House a year and a half from now. And there's a lesson that he and many others learned the hard way from the Obama-Biden years, which was that you've got to try to squeeze all your biggest, most ambitious plans into those first 2 years. $4 trillion in spending, that's really ambitious. A lot of the things that are in those spending packages are incredibly popular. I mean, you're talking about universal pre-K and lowering the cost of childcare and free community college. Those pull right up there with puppies and babies. But he's going to have to now sell the size of those plans to the American people. He did it tonight. He's going to be traveling for the next 2 weeks to make the case, trying to show the lawmakers who are in that chamber, who sat on their hands for a lot of his speech, that this is something that the American people want.
The president saying this is the largest jobs plan since World War II. And Joel, his substance, very progressive, but what about his style?
Well, it's so funny because I know Republicans all over Washington, D.C., all over the country have been trying to figure out, how do you box in, how do you bracket Joe Biden? He's so difficult to do that because he speaks as a deal-making moderate, but he governs as a progressive. He governs like FDR or LBJ, but he talks about working with Republicans. He shouted out Mitch McConnell when he talked about the piece of legislation dedicated to his son's name. So the style of Joe Biden is so effective at really complementing a very, very progressive, go big, bottom-up agenda. He talked about that a lot tonight, and I think it's been pretty successful for him so far.
There were other moments, too, that brought Republicans to their feet, including the Republican leader of the House, McCarthy, not just cancer, but other issues.
That's right. And, you know, the president wanted to talk a lot about jobs today. You could tell jobs was a really big priority for the speech. He also wanted to take a victory lap on vaccine distribution, on the COVID crisis. We've seen a really meteoric jump in confidence, in public confidence, and government reaction to the COVID crisis, and the president took a meaningful victory lap on that. And I think you're going to see a lot of Democrats talking up the fact that the president and his team have prioritized it, and they've really, really, really made it a point to stick the landing and to sell the victory.
You know, the thing I'm struck by, too, Nancy, they do have this sense of urgency, not because they also believe that ultimately America is in a state of crisis, but also because of this idea that the Democrats only have a 3-4 seat majority in the House. They could lose that in the midterms, that if they want to get this big stuff done, they have to do it now while the Democrats have the majority. But the list is so long.
Right.
I mean, in addition to this jobs plan, infrastructure, human infrastructure, he mentioned guns. He mentioned immigration. What's realistic?
Race and policing, voting rights. I mean, the list goes on. And there are Democrats who are sometimes frustrated that he doesn't put some of these other issues at the top of the agenda. They think that those things are almost more important. But you've got to start somewhere. And Joe Biden, with his 3 decades in the Senate, knows better than anyone that if you try to crowd the agenda and do everything at once, often the whole plan can fall apart. Congress does not do well when it's focusing on a whole bunch of things at the same time. time. And so he's going to start with infrastructure, hoping that he can ram that through over the next couple of months. He is sitting down next week with Republicans who have a counter proposal, but it is only about a quarter of the size of the infrastructure package that he is proposing, and it pays for itself in a completely different way. It's really hard to see right now how these two sides meet in the middle.
Right. My sources tell me essentially that the president wanted to deliver this whole plan not only to the American people but to the lawmakers, including some of the bipartisan aspects of it, and then start lobbying these Republicans directly. And so next week, the sell specifically to Republicans begin when he has the big four, I think as you call it, the leaders in the House and the Senate and the Democrat and Republican to the White House to say, how do we work together? How do we make it?
Norah, I'm struck by the simplicity of the Biden approach and the Biden plans. Even the names of them: American Families Plan, American Jobs Plan, American Rescue Plan. The president and his team have decided we need to take the temperature down in Washington and across the country. And everything stylistically they've done has supported that notion.
I'm just struck looking at the president here. He's still in the chamber. He's still chatting with lawmakers, which is sort of unique to this president. So many other moments, so different from what we've seen in years past. Obviously, the sight of the first female vice president standing up there with a female Speaker of the House. It was just 1 year ago that Nancy Pelosi was ripping up at this time the speech that she had just heard delivered by President Trump. So a very different atmosphere there in the House chamber this evening.
Yeah, speaking there with Jim Clyburn, of course, the congressman who in many ways people say helped deliver Joe Biden, South Carolina, and ultimately the Democratic nomination. Let's bring in Ed O'Keefe, our White House correspondent. And Ed, what stood out to you in the speech?
Well, Norah, good to be with you as we watch him continue to walk out here. First part of this speech sounded like a message much more for the rest of the country, trying to remind them what's been accomplished so far, his optimism about what's coming next, his push to get these infrastructure plans. But as the night wore on, it sort of sounded as if we were watching the president talk to Congress, not a president talking to the nation in front of Congress, trying to implore them, get these things done. Get me that policing reform bill by Memorial Day when George Floyd died. Get these other issues done. And the other interesting point, he wants to go big. But what he was signaling to them was, if there are ways you can go small and more specific on immigration or on gun control, do it and send it my way and we'll get back to work on the bigger things. And the other point that sticks out to me on foreign policy tonight, this is probably one of the first times in this setting we've heard an American president try to talk to Congress and to the American public about the ongoing rise of China and what's coming if President Xi gets his way and other autocratic leaders around the world get their way. He's talked about democracy versus autocracy and the need to make sure that democracy remains stable and strong in this country, but to do it in this setting, to try to remind his colleagues in Congress that the Chinese threat is coming, to remind Americans that he knows the Chinese leader and knows what he's thinking, is something very different than we've heard before. He will continue this sales pitch tomorrow with a trip to Georgia, then to Philadelphia on Friday, and as Nancy said, with more stops next week. But tonight, a much more data-driven conversation with people he knows well.
It's an excellent point, Ed. President Xi of China has warned against a new Cold War with America. You hear the President Biden saying multiple times, we have to prove democracy still works. The autocrats will not win the future. There is this belief, a philosophy within the president's foreign policy team as well, that the question of American democracy is actually at stake around the world. That President Xi is saying, your type of government doesn't work. You guys argue. You can't get anything done. And by the way, while you guys are all arguing in Congress, we're building, we're way ahead of you technologically, militarily, all of those things. So they not only believe this is a way of making America better, but that we may lose our superpower status if we don't start getting stuff done in Congress.
You're so right, Norah. And you talked about how he wanted to prove that democracy still works. I think the entire speech was, I want to prove government still works. And, I'm reading just directly off the text. We have to prove democracy still works, that our government still works and can deliver for the people. It really seems like these first 100 days and this entire speech, it's a proof of concept that Joe Biden's idea about proving that government is us and we can make government work, this was the realization of that. It was the embodiment of that concept of Joe Biden's core belief.
And he also used China as an argument for passing infrastructure legislation and all of this human infrastructure legislation. He says we've got to compete, and in order to do that, we've got to spend more on childcare and on education and on our infrastructure. We shouldn't be fighting with each other. We should be fighting with our competitors.
Yeah, there you have it. And Joe Biden spending a lot of time to meet and greet with both Republican and Democratic lawmakers. Earlier, he met with staff, the Capitol staff, including janitors, people who take care of the Capitol in sort of a different way to sort of show respect for many of those who had suffered through the January 6th attacks. We should note that now as the president makes his way back to the White House, we are going to take a quick break. But when we come back, we will hear the Republican response delivered by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, the only Republican lawmaker in the United States Senate. And welcome back to CBS News coverage of the president's address to Congress. We are about to hear shortly the Republican address to the nation delivered by Senator Tim Scott. He's been selected to deliver the Republican Party's response to President Biden. And we should note, I misspoke just a short time ago. Senator Scott, of course, is the first African-American senator from South Carolina, and he is the only Republican, black Republican serving in the United States Senate. He spoke at the Republican convention. He is well liked on both sides of the aisle. He's leading the Republican effort on police reform, along with Senator Cory Booker, the Democrat of New Jersey, and Karen Bass, the Democratic Congresswoman from Carolina. And I'm told by Speaker Pelosi today that they could have something soon in terms of a police reform bill, and I think many people waiting for that. But this is a new effort by the Republican Party. They want outreach. They've got to grow their base.
Right, and he's a very well-liked Republican with a very intriguing backstory. He grew up in poverty. He's been very open about the fact that he didn't even come to Washington until he was elected.
Tim Scott from the great state of South Carolina. We just heard President Biden's first address to Congress. Our president seems like a good man. His speech was full of good words. But President Biden promised you a specific kind of leadership. He promised to unite a nation, to lower the temperature, to govern for all Americans, no matter how we voted. This was the pitch. You just heard it again. But our nation is starving for more than empty platitudes. We need policies and progress that brings us closer together. But 3 months in, the actions of the president and his party are pulling us further and further apart. I won't waste your time with finger pointing or partisan bickering. You can get that on TV anytime you want. I want to have an honest conversation about common sense and common ground, about this feeling that our nation is sliding off its shared foundation and how we move forward together. Growing up, I never dreamed I would be standing here tonight. When I was a kid, my parents divorced. My mother, my brother, and I moved in with my grandparents, 3 of us sharing one bedroom. I was disillusioned and angry, and I nearly failed out of school. But I was blessed. First, with a praying mama. And let me say this to the single mothers out there who are working their tails off, working hard, trying to make the ends meet, wondering if it's worth it, you can bet it is. God bless your amazing effort on the part of your kids. I was also blessed by a Chick-fil-A operator, John Moniz, and finally with a string of opportunities that are only possible here in America. This past year, I've watched COVID attack every rung of the ladder that helped me up. So many families have lost parents and grandparents too early. So many small businesses have gone under. Becoming a Christian transformed my life, but for months, too many churches were shut down. Most of all, I'm saddened that millions of kids have lost a year of learning when they could not afford to lose a single day. Locking vulnerable kids out of the classroom is locking adults out of their future. Our public schools should have reopened months ago. Other countries did. Private and religious schools did. Science has shown for months that schools are safe. But too often, powerful grown-ups set science aside, and kids like me were left behind. The clearest case I've seen for school choice in our lifetimes, because we know that education is the closest thing to magic in America. Last year, under Republican leadership, we passed 5 bipartisan COVID packages. Congress supported our schools, our hospitals, saved our economy, and funded Operation Warp Speed, delivering vaccines in record time. All 5 bills got 90 votes in the Senate. Common sense found common ground. In February, Republicans told President Biden we wanted to keep working together to finish this fight. But Democrats wanted to go it alone. They spent almost $2 trillion on a partisan bill that the White House bragged was the most liberal bill in American history. Only 1% went to vaccinations, no requirement to reopen schools promptly. COVID brought Congress together 5 times. This administration pushed us apart. Another issue that should unite us is infrastructure. Republicans support everything you think of when you think of infrastructure. Roads, bridges, ports, airports, waterways, high-speed broadband. We're in for all of that. But again, Democrats want a partisan wish list. They won't even build bridges to build bridges. Less than 6% of the president's plan goes to roads and bridges. It's a liberal wish list of big government waste, plus the biggest job-killing tax hikes in a generation. Experts say when all is said and done, it would lower wages of the average American worker and shrink our economy. Tonight, we also heard about a so-called family plan, even more taxing, even more spending, to put Washington even more in the middle of your life, from the cradle to college. The beauty of the American dream is that families get to define it for themselves. We should be expanding opportunities and options for all families, not throwing money at certain issues because Democrats think they know best. Infrastructure spending that shrinks our economy is not common sense. Weakening our southern borders and creating a crisis is not compassionate. The president is also abandoning principles he's held for decades. Now he says your tax dollars should fund abortions. He's laying groundwork to pack the Supreme Court. This is not common ground. Nowhere do we need common ground more desperately than in our discussions of race. I have experienced the pain of discrimination. I know what it feels like to be pulled over for no reason, to be followed around the store while I'm shopping. I remember every morning at the kitchen table, my grandfather would open the newspaper and read it, I thought. But later I realized he had never learned to read it. He just wanted to set the right example. I've also experienced a different kind of intolerance. I get called Uncle Tom and the N-word by progressives, by liberals. Just last week, a national newspaper suggested my family's poverty was actually privilege because a relative owned land generations before my time. Believe me, I know firsthand our healing is not finished. In 2015, after the shooting of Walter Scott, I wrote a bill to fund body cameras. Last year, after the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, I built an even bigger police reform proposal. But my Democratic colleagues blocked it. I extended an olive branch. I offered amendments, but Democrats used a filibuster to block the debate from even happening. My friends across the aisle seemed to want the issue more than they wanted a solution. But I'm still working. I'm hopeful that this will be different. When America comes together, we've made tremendous progress, but powerful forces want to pull us apart. 100 years ago, kids in classrooms were taught the color of their skin was their most important characteristic. And if they looked a certain way, they were inferior. Today, kids are being taught that the color of their skin defines them again. And if they look a certain way, they're an oppressor. From colleges to corporations to our culture, people are making money and gaining power by pretending we haven't made any progress at all, by doubling down on the divisions we've worked so hard to heal. You know this stuff is wrong. Hear me clearly. America is not a racist country. It's backwards to fight discrimination with different types of discrimination. And it's wrong to try to use our painful past to dishonestly shut down debates in the present. I'm an African American who's voted in the South my entire life. I take voting rights personally. Republicans support making it easier to vote and harder to cheat, and so do the voters. Big majorities of Americans support early voting, and big majorities support voter ID, including African Americans and Hispanics. Common sense makes common ground. But today, this conversation has collapsed. The state of Georgia passed a law that expands early voting, preserves no excuse mail-in voting, and despite what the president claimed, did not reduce election day hours. If you actually read this law, it's mainstream. It will be easier to vote early in Georgia than in Democrat-run New York. But the left doesn't want you to know that. They want people virtue signaling by yelling about a law they haven't even read. Fact checkers have called out the White House for misstatements. The president absurdly claims that this is worse than Jim Crow. What is going on here? I'll tell you, a Washington power grab. This misplaced outrage is supposed to justify Democrats' new sweeping bill that would take over elections for all 50 states. It would send public funds to political campaigns you disagree with and make the bipartisan Federal Elections Commission partisan. This is not about civil rights or our racial past. It's about rigging elections in the future. And no, the same filibuster that President Obama and President Biden praised when they were senators, the same filibuster that the Democrats used to kill my police reform bill last year, has not suddenly become a racist relic just because the shoe is now on the other foot. Race is not a political weapon to settle every issue the way one side wants. It's far too important. This should be a joyful springtime for our nation. This administration inherited a tide that had already turned. The coronavirus is on the run. Thanks to Operation Warp Speed and the Trump administration, our country is flooded with safe and effective vaccines. Thanks to our bipartisan work last year, job openings are rebounding. So why do we feel so divided? Anxious. A nation with so much cause for hope should not feel so heavy laden. A president who promised to bring us together should not be pushing agendas that tear us apart. The American family deserves better, and we know what better looks like. Just before COVID, we had the most inclusive economy in my lifetime, the lowest unemployment rates ever recorded for African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians, and a 70-year low nearly for women. Wages were growing faster at the bottom than at the top. The bottom 25% saw their wages go up faster than the top 25%. That happened because Republicans focused on expanding opportunity for all Americans. In addition to that, we passed opportunity zones, criminal justice reform, and permanent funding for historically Black colleges and universities for the first time ever. We fought the drug epidemic, rebuilt our military, and cut taxes for working families and single moms like the one that raised me. Our best future will not come from Washington schemes or socialist dreams. It will come from you, the American people, Black, Hispanic, white, and Asian, Republican and Democrat, brave police officers in Black neighborhoods. We are not adversaries. We are family. We are all in this together, and we get to live in the greatest country on earth. The country where my grandfather in his 94 years saw his family go from cotton to Congress in one lifetime. So I am more than hopeful. I am confident that our finest hour is yet to come. Original sin is never the end of the story, not in our souls and not for our nation. The real story is always redemption. I am standing here because my mom has prayed me through some really tough times. I believe our nation has succeeded the same way because generations of Americans in their own ways have asked for grace and God has supplied it. So I will close with a word from a worship song that really helped me through this past year of COVID. The music is new, but the words draw from Scripture. May the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May his presence go before you and behind you and beside you. In your weeping and your rejoicing, he is for you. May his favor be upon our nation for 1,000 generations, and your family and your children and their children. Good night, and God bless the United States of America.
And there is the Republican response to President Biden from Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. Some of his Republican colleagues urging him to run for president in 2024. Let's go now to the Capitol, and CBS's Nicole Killian is standing by. And Nicole, why did the Republican Party want Senator Scott to deliver the response?
Well, he is seen as a rising star in the Republican Party. And as you mentioned earlier, it's the Senate's only Black Republican. It really has this rags to riches story, which we heard him describe a little bit in that address, much as he did during the Republican National Convention, where he also got a lot of attention to his personal story and his, really embodiment of the American dream to many. But what you also heard from him more specifically were a number of Republican themes and talking points that we have heard from Republicans for weeks now with respect to the president's approach and Democrats' approach in terms of trying to go it alone. For instance, on the COVID relief bill, contrary to the last Congress where it was a more bipartisan approach. You also heard him really rip into voting rights legislation, which I think could draw some controversy here on the Hill, and talk about police reform as well, which, as you know, he's one of the key negotiators, accusing Democrats of actually blocking his bill last time around, but feeling more hopeful this time. Norah?
All right, Nicole Killian on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Nicole. And as Nicole just mentioned, Senator Scott leading the Republican effort on police reform, a bipartisan effort to try and get something done. President Biden mentioning the George Floyd Act, calling for its passage in his speech tonight. Let's get more on this from CBS's Chief Justice and Homeland Security correspondent Jeff Pegues. And Jeff, they're negotiating it. They're keeping it pretty quiet. But what are some of the keys that you think that they will find agreement on? No chokeholds. What else?
Yeah, no chokeholds, this idea of no-knock warrants. Obviously, that was an issue with Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and the raid there, the deadly raid there. But, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act right now held up in Congress. It passed the House. But it's stuck in the Senate. And the question is, will they be able to pass it by the deadline here that the president has just set, Memorial Day, George Floyd's death last year? And there are a lot of people in law enforcement who believe that legislation on its own won't be enough to ease some of the tension in communities across America right now.
Isn't one of the key issues about whether you can sue a police officer?
that is the holdup. It's called qualified immunity, and it's something that's on the books now, but there are a lot of states moving to get rid of it, to end it, so that you could sue individual police officers. But that's something that Republican senators have stated that they won't go for, and there are law enforcement organizations across the country who are against it as well. And so that's one of the major issues. There are some, though, who say, why don't you take that aspect of the legislation out and let's go forward with what we agree on?
Sure. All right, Jeff Pegues, thank you. And Joel, we heard from Senator Scott, but he's not really the one that the Republican Party puts out front in terms of many of its issues.
I think that's so right. The dominant voices you hear from the Republican Party are Marjorie Taylor Greene, former President Trump, Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy. It's great that they want to highlight a young, dynamic conservative like Tim Scott, but there's some disambiguation with what people normally hear from the Republican Party and what they saw tonight, which was a very workmanlike, yeomanlike speech from Senator Scott. We'll see if it lands.
All right, thank you. All right, there's a lot more ahead, including the president's plea to Americans to get their shots as COVID vaccinations drop off. More straight ahead.
Everyone over the age of 16, everyone is now eligible to get vaccinated right now, right away. Go get vaccinated, America. Go and get the vaccination. They're available.
President Biden imploring Americans to get vaccinated against COVID, and that with vaccine supplies suddenly outstripping demand. Let's turn now to CBS News chief medical correspondent, Dr. Jon LaPook. And John, as we hear the president imploring people to get their shot, there are still a significant number of Americans who are hesitant. How does one change their minds?
That's exactly right. And Norah, I was surprised. I thought it was a missed opportunity tonight to address this vaccine hesitancy that you mentioned. About 17% of Americans, by the last poll, say they're on the fence. They're going to wait and see. And you can't address the whole thing. It's such a huge topic. But he could have addressed two top concerns. One is, I hear it all the time, this was developed so quickly in a couple of months. How could it be safe? Well, it wasn't developed just in a couple of months. Yes, it was about 2 months from the time the Chinese published the sequence till they had the vaccine ready for testing. But it was based on technology that was around for 10, 20 years. In fact, in 2003, SARS-1, there was a vaccine that took 20 months. And then it got less and less over the years with vaccine platform technology. Zika took 3 months. This took 2 months. So what happened much more quickly was the testing of it. And that was part of Operation Warp Speed. You got to give them credit for that. They cut the red tape without cutting corners. And it was all hands on deck. And they bought millions of doses of the vaccine at risk. If it hadn't worked, they just would have been out of money. So there's an answer for that. The other is people saying, well, has it been out there long enough? Was it really tested? Well, there were 74,000 people in the trials for just the Pfizer and Moderna alone combined. And then since then, we have hundreds of millions of people getting the vaccine. It seemed quite safe. And remember, we had this clotting, this very rare clotting abnormality that happened with women. 1 in a million in women over 50, 7 in a million in women under 50. And yet the monitoring process picked that up. And to me, that should give people process that, yes, it's out there. There are always some rare risks, but they're being picked up.
Right, that transparency by the government, incredibly important, very safe for millions and millions of Americans. Dr. LaPook, always good to have you. Thank you so much. And we're joined now by Republican Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa. And Senator Ernst, so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. You heard the president make his pitch tonight for what he calls the largest jobs plan since World War II that would offer a lot of blue-collar jobs. What in that bill would you support?
Well, there are a lot of things that I could support, and simply put, it's infrastructure. And that's exactly what Shelley Moore Capito, Senator Capito, has put forward, is a Republican plan that is all about infrastructure. Unfortunately, what we have seen with the jobs plan is less than 5 to 6% of the Biden proposal actually goes towards infrastructure. Americans want their tax dollars to be spent wisely on things that they expect our federal government to do, That's infrastructure, that's the GOP plan. What I did hear President Biden say, though, was that he is very glad that Republicans are working on this issue, and he hopes that we can bring these two plans together and find a way forward for the American people. I was very, very glad that he said that, and I hope he is sincere.
Right, the president proposing what is physical infrastructure and then what he calls personal infrastructure or human infrastructure to go alongside that plan, the American Families Plan, in his words. It includes universal pre-K, child care, among other things, paying for community college. Is that something that Republicans will not support?
Well, no, I think there are a number of efforts that are already underway, and certainly they are bipartisan efforts. I've been working with, of course, Senator Amy Klobuchar on the child care front, a number of others in these areas. We are working on paid family leave, and that's something that Republicans and Democrats have been interested in working together on. So I think there are avenues on moving forward, but certainly when the president is talking about free community college or free college, we need to be very careful about what the word free actually means. Somebody at some point is going to pay for that.
And while we have you, Senator, I do want to address the issue of sexual assault in the military. It's a story we've done a number of investigations on. I know you have spent a lot of time on this issue. And tomorrow you are introducing legislation, bipartisan legislation, that will fundamentally change how sexual assault is reported in the military. Tell us about that.
Yes, and thank you, Norah. And I want to give you kudos as well, because you have followed this very carefully over the past number of years, and I do appreciate your reporting on this issue. And this has been a very difficult path for me. I am a survivor of sexual assault. I am a former company commander, battalion commander, and I take those responsibilities very, very seriously. But what we see within the military, even through the past number of years where we've tried to make improvements to the system, we are simply not seeing those numbers in sexual assault and domestic violence go down. So it is time to make a change. So I stepped forward, started working with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a good friend across the aisle, and we came together on a plan that does remove the decision of prosecution away from those commanders, and it does go to a special prosecutor. However, the part that I put forward is prevention, prevention, prevention. We need to stop the assault before it ever happens.
Well, Senator Joni Ernst, thank you so much for your time tonight. We appreciate it.
God bless you, Norah. Thank you.
Thank you. And, you know, as we think about this evening tonight, this is the beginning, really, in some ways, for President Biden. He was doing the rescue part with his first big bill to get all those vaccines out, to get the $1,400 checks to 85% of American households. Now he's doing what he calls the recovery. The question is, really, can there really be an infrastructure plan that's ever passed? Trump said he wanted to do it. Will they get it done?
Well, he's already a step ahead of President Trump because President Trump never actually introduced a plan. The risk for President Biden, as you heard from both Senator Ernst and Senator Scott in his Republican response, is the risk of going so big that you allow the other side to paint you as a prolific spender. No one really knows what's in this package.
Tim Scott said socialist dreams.
Exactly. And, you know, going big means it's one and done. And that is an advantage of taking this approach. The downside is you make it easier for your opponents to pick out things in that huge package that they don't like and to run ads and try to convince Americans that the whole thing needs to be scrapped.
We talk about the lines that got both Republicans and Democrats to go on their feet, and there's no reason the blades for wind turbines can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing. Everyone believes in Made in America.
Cheering on America is always going to do well on a night like this. Norah, a theme that I see throughout the Biden presidency, I saw tonight, it's the common thread, and it's taking the temperature down. not just COVID, not just the last 4 years of Donald Trump, but really the last 20 years in American political life has been really intense. And I think the president has decided the American people need me to come in and be a healing balm. And I think you are seeing that as a core part of his political philosophy and ideology. Let's bring the temperature down. Let's less flash, less partisanship. At least let's talk about less flash and less partisanship. But let's go big on the things that matter.
And let's bring in Ed O'Keefe finally. And Ed, what does the president do now to sell this plan?
Well, first he heads back to a critical battleground state of Georgia, of course, a key state for his victory last year, and one that delivered 2 Democratic senators to Congress that made it possible for Democrats to pass that rescue plan. He'll go Friday to Pennsylvania, another critical battleground state, to talk about the infrastructure plan.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, thank you. And thanks to everybody. Our coverage will continue on our streaming network, CBSN, your local news, and tomorrow on CBS This Morning with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Thank you to all our correspondents and contributors. I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. Hope you have a good night.